Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of BioLogic Science News. Today I'll be discussing a recent paper from researchers at Cornell that came out in the astrophysical journal Letters. The paper, titled Volcanic Hydrogen Habitable Zone, argues that the presence of volcanoes belching hydrogen into a planetary atmosphere may improve the odds for life. The atmosphere of the Earth is hugely influential on all forms of life that come in contact with it, almost everything. So it follows that any life on other worlds should be similarly affected by their atmosphere. Many geologic processes influence the atmosphere as well, like the warming of permafrost that releases carbon dioxide, or the eruption of volcanoes that spews out ash and sulfur dioxide. These processes involve huge amounts of chemicals being thrown into the air from deep underground, introducing new greenhouse gases or light-reflecting substances that can radically alter the composition or temperature of an atmosphere. And life is forced to respond to these alterations. When the first photosynthetic life filled the oceans, they expelled through respiration molecular oxygen, which eventually saturated the atmosphere. These cyanobacteria produced enough oxygen to saturate all the iron deposits on the planet, which led to the oxygen accumulating in the atmosphere. As oxygen was toxic to most carbon dioxide-breathing organisms alive at the time, this led to a series of extinctions called the Great Oxygenation Crisis, or the Oxygen Holocaust. When volcanoes erupt, the living creatures near the eruption have to deal with the massive increases in local concentrations of carbon and sulfur dioxide. Most of the worst chemicals of a volcanic eruption can be scrubbed out of the air through rain. But if the eruption is large enough, it might mimic an asteroid strike by throwing up ash and dust that could block out the sun. This can happen when supervolcanoes erupt. Life on the surface responds by finding ways to survive the incoming cold and darkness, just as the mammals did after the KT extinction event that wiped out the dinosaurs. Greenhouse gases like methane and carbon dioxide can have radical influences on the temperature, and thus the habitability of a planet. Depending on its chemical composition, a planetary atmosphere might insulate a planet and keep it warm, despite it being relatively far from its star. In the abstract of the paper, the authors argue that hydrogen in particular might be an effective greenhouse gas, capable of keeping a planet warm enough to possibly maintain liquid water, even past the cold edge of what we would consider the habitable zone. I quote the authors from the abstract of their paper, where they say, "The outer edge of the traditional nitrogen, carbon dioxide, water habitable zone extends out to nearly 1.7 AU. Here we show the volcanic outgassing of atmospheric hydrogen can extend the outer edge of the habitable zone to 2.4 AU in our solar system. This wider volcanic hydrogen habitable zone of nitrogen, carbon dioxide, water, and hydrogen can be sustained as long as volcanic hydrogen output offsets its escape from the top of the atmosphere." In other words, this means that a planet in our solar system with an Earth-like atmosphere, like Earth, the composition of our atmosphere can only retain enough heat to support liquid water when the planet orbits up to 1.7 AU away. Beyond this, the nitrogen, water, carbon dioxide atmosphere just wouldn't be able to hold on to enough of the input energy, the heat energy from the sun, to keep water from freezing. But if the planet were to possess volcanoes or something that just spewed titanic, continuous amounts of molecular hydrogen into the atmosphere, this mixture would be able to retain enough heat to keep liquid water on its surface up to about 2.4 AU away from the star. That's a 0.7 AU increase in the size of the habitable zone, which is massive. For a star our size, that's a huge increase. In the paper, they discussed their computational model, and they describe the effects of hydrogen in the atmosphere at concentrations from 1 up to 50%. The researchers found that at higher concentrations of hydrogen in the atmosphere, around 45 to 50% concentration, the amount of heat energy needed from the star to keep the planet warm enough to support liquid water decreased by 35 to 60%. So the amount of heat energy from the sun needed to keep liquid water on the surface decreased by a third to more than half. That's huge. The hydrogen in the atmosphere is basically good enough at keeping in heat that it makes up for the lower amount of heat energy that comes in from the star, and this keeps the atmosphere warm and stable enough for liquid water. And so this is where stuff gets really exciting. I mean, it's exciting already, but this is where it gets really exciting. This greenhouse effect, this capacity to hold on to heat with less energy input from the star, makes the habitable zone of that planet much larger. Planets with high concentrations of hydrogen in their atmosphere can enjoy a habitable zone that's 30 to 60% larger than planets with just Earth-like atmospheres. Planets with high concentrations of hydrogen in their atmosphere can enjoy a habitable zone that's 30 to 60% larger than planets with just regular old Earth-like atmospheres. The researchers found that as long as hydrogen input by processes like volcanoes outpaced the rate at which hydrogen was stripped from a planet by things like the solar wind, the heating effect could be maintained and the habitable zone widened. This is excellent news for life, as a wider habitable zone improves the likelihood that a planet can host liquid water, and if it can do that, it can potentially host life. Anything that increases the size of the habitable zone increases the odds for life. This has big implications for the recently discovered TRAPPIST-1 star system, whose outermost planet is believed to be an ice-covered world that possibly has a hydrogen-rich atmosphere. Such discoveries increase our chances of finding life in outer space.